Okay, so we're back with part two. Um, so the one-child policy really affects the society most dramatically with a subset, a particular generation of women that we refer to as the baby boom women of China, or sometimes they refer to themselves through their experiences, not just with the one-child policy, but with the major events of China's 20th century, as the unhappy generation. And this is because they're part of this population explosion that's registered in the 1982 census. That as young children or teens experiences the famine and disruption of the Great Leap Forward, then in their late teens and 20s participate in or become targets of the Red Guards and all the turmoil of that. And then in the 1980s experience the ideological shift towards reform enacted by Deng Xiaoping, the implementation of the one-child policy in their 20s and 30s then affects their family planning and their ambitions in that stage in life. And this is an enormous subset of women in China. The census shows us that in 1982 there are 60 million women who are between the ages of 30 and 39. There's 80 million women of the ages 20 to 29. And there is some 125 million women from ages 10 to 20. And so it's these women who are going to be affected by the one-child policy. And they also have a very unique perspective on their lives and what it means to be communist because they were born into socialism. They know nothing in terms of education or propaganda other than what Mao and communism has promised them. And that's that they're going to be this generation that's going to break out of the constraints of the household. They're going to have careers and professions and be very active publicly. They'll be members of the party. They'll be politically conscious. They're going to stand equally with men in all aspects of society. In fact, equality is announced that it's been achieved. It's perfect by the time of the Cultural Revolution. So they're socially ambitious. They really value their independence because it's something promised to them and it's something that shows they're patriotic and they're good citizens and they're good communists and they're very politically conscious. They're aware of the ways in which their lives deviate from these expectations because that's what they've been told they will achieve and that their lives will be radically different from their parents. So even before the one-child policy, these women... sorry, I'm playing with my screen here. These women experience a number of things that begin to lead them to question communism and to question their own emancipation. For instance, as children and their families, they notice that sons still are given preferential treatment and have greater access to things like education. They look at their lives of their mother or what they're expected to, the duties in the home that they're expected to perform and notice that there's really no significant change in domestic labor, that women are still supposed to be responsible to care for their husbands or their sons, to cook, to clean, to nurture children, to do all kinds of functions in terms of festivals that are expected of women. They also then head out into the workforce in their teens and 20s and notice that the workplace is still largely segregated. Now, there's greater numbers of women in areas where they haven't been prior to communism. That has greatly changed. In fact, 70% of the workforce in light industries are women, things such as service, textile, and carrying industries. But in terms of status, these are much lower. These are seen as lower contributions in society. There is a 20% of women that work in heavy industries, but often they're kind of working in these things like the construction of dams or factories that make tanks or large machinery. They're given positions that, again, are thought more suitable for women and carry less value or compensation. Like, for instance, they might work in a factory but work in the kitchen, or they might work in the factory but provide entertainment and services. We see this also in areas where men and women are working in roughly equal numbers. And the big area there where we have parity is agriculture. The labor force, men are given tasks that are thought to be more physically demanding or skilled. Skilled jobs, almost always, in both agriculture and industry, are reserved for men. So men are learning how to use machinery or learning new techniques that women are thought and capable of mastering. But with agriculture, even simple things like men are given the job of carrying rice while women stoop and plant. Now, because men are carrying the rice, it's thought to be more physically demanding, and so the points they can earn, the points related to the compensation or the benefits they enjoy, it's possible that they'll earn 10 points. Women, the highest possible they can earn for squatting and planting the seeds is 5, even at high performance. So it's an interesting thing. One other interesting fact that we've seen with this generation of women is even those women that do occupy, that do break into a skilled job or have a position in heavy industry that's very high paying and rewarding, over time, they give these jobs up. They actually take lower paid or jobs that are seen as inferior. And why would that be? Well, one of the answers is because of the constraints they have at home. At least according to these women themselves. They say that because of their duties in child rearing or their duties in taking care of the home or the expectations of what they would provide as a host, all these things that they had to do at the home were so great that they decided it was worth it to give up these higher paying positions so that then they wouldn't feel like they're always falling behind in taking care of their kids or their husband. This kind of inequality between men and women that's been narrowed during communism is also still present in politics. We see women in party to a greater degree, but they primarily occupy lower levels of government, with the exception, of course, of the Politburo member Chen Jianying, as Spence mentions. But most of this generation's frustrations, most of its conflict, most of their expectations about equality that then are denied or frustrated are focused on the Danwei, the work unit and its leadership. And this is because that unit has kind of supplanted their parents, kind of like we saw in To Live. And locally, it's in the past who had done things like performed arranged marriages or kind of decided the nature of their family. Those are now functions of the state through the Danwei. The Danwei arranges marriages. The Danwei arranges housing, which is almost men are given flats once they reach a certain age. Women stay in their home until they're married. So women can't get those flats. So that's a frustrating point. But then after marriage, the Danwei continues to play an incredible role in maintaining marriages and monitoring them. For instance, one of the most critical functions we see of Danweis is we have a great number of extramarital affairs by men in the 1960s and 1970s. And the Danwei is constantly counseling women to maintain these marriages. And we find through their rhetoric often encouraging women that they're at fault for the affair, that they've not performed wifely duties or that they've failed their husbands in some measure, and that's why they've strayed. And then the most critical issue for the women that come of age and begin to have families in the late 1970s and 1980s is family planning. It's the Danwei that's going to be responsible for monitoring family size, arranging later marriages and the spacing of children, and then enforcing the one-child policy. A last key condition that women experience that's kind of formative for this generation is their participation in the Cultural Revolution, or as the targets of the Cultural Revolution. Women participate as Red Guards, but women are also the targets of Red Guards, particularly because women who are seen as too feminine, they wear clothes that are not the standard uniform, the Maoist uniform, or have different hairstyles, or just practice things that are seen as traditional of women. They're targeted by Red Guards, and then through that targeting, the Red Guards often use that to justify sexual assault, including rape, or other acts of a sexual nature that are intended to humiliate these people. Now, the Red Guards themselves among women also find that when they're sent to the countryside, and these periodic waves that we see going out, where Red Guards are kind of disbanded and removed from urban areas, 1966, 1968, 1974, 75, that once there, that then either local leaders or people taking advantage of the fact that they're far removed from home often exact sexual privileges from them. And so they've kind of been made vulnerable by the resettlement or the removal to the countryside to sexual assault too. Now, then they will come back in great waves to the urban areas after Mao's death in 1976 and the 1970s, and then again in conflict with the Danwei. Now, in some ways, the Danwei gives women greater freedom because they can refuse to have children if that's something that interests them. They can devote the less time to family and more time to career or to things outside the home. And they can frame this as a patriotic act. They're helping the country. But other women are forced to make very difficult decisions through family planning and under great pressure by both their husband, potentially, and the Danwei, who is, again, responsible for enforcing these things, particularly the birth of a male to carry on the family line. And we see this most often when you have a family that's first child is female. Given allowance for a second child that's male, often the Danwei will then encourage women to selectively abort the second child if it's female, to disguise this child's birth by not registering it, which allows the child to live, but means it also doesn't have the rights of a normal citizen. It doesn't have a hukou. It can't participate in education unless it's somehow fabricating documents. And so basically it's a non-citizen. And then a third way that we see this is infanticide, which is difficult for us to assess. These missing girls in the 1980s, 1990s, and then the 2000s. Infanticide does have a long tradition in China, but the stories and accounts that we know about are subject to rumor and a bit of sensationalism. So it's really difficult to assess how many women were born and then killed, especially because there's selective abortion becomes really popular. By the late 1980s, by the mid 1980s, Chinese families have access to things such as ultrasonography, which makes the determination of birth possible. Now, the state will actually make these types of technologies illegal because what it doesn't want is people continuing to abort until they get a boy, because that will result in an even greater gender imbalance, which is already happening. There's going to be an imbalance between males and females born to the point where 1.5 males are born for every female birth in China. So it doesn't want people to just, okay, not going to have a daughter, we're just going to have boys. But at the local level where these policies are enforced, there's often ways of getting around this, including a private industry where you can go outside of doctors and have this done and then have the sex determined. This might lead you to think that almost all women are having abortions, but it's really interesting that in China, something like 25% of women during this era have an abortion, whereas in the United States, it's something like 43%. And even with the gender imbalance that we see, it's roughly the same as we see because of the preference for males in other neighboring states where we have a strong Confucian tradition, like Taiwan, South Korea, and even outside of the Confucian tradition in northern India. Roughly about the same gender imbalance is seen because of a preference among families for males. So this one-child policy, it does alienate women because their choices about birth are politicized. They're taken over and they're intervened upon by the state. And they're all framed as a national sacrifice. Limiting population is something that women must do and must give up control over their choices in order to make sure that China is transformed into a market economy and that population growth doesn't harm the country as it undergoes kind of a chaotic period of reform. But there's other experiences tied to reform that are part and parcel of this experience that are leading to this generation of women to come to identify themselves as kind of an unhappy generation, to see the sacrifices demanded of them from the state as too extreme. And hey, I've got 2 more slides. I'm going to need another video. All right, thanks.